Hi, I'm Drew Halfmann from UC Davis Sociology. Today I'll address the question, in what ways has the American welfare state disadvantaged African Americans? I'll start by talking about a number of ways in which the welfare state is bad for all disadvantaged groups in the American welfare state. First of all, and when I'm talking about women, Latinos, African Americans, first of all, these groups tend to receive more of their benefits from means-tested programs where you have to be below a certain income level to receive them. And those programs tend to be stingier, less generous, more stigmatizing than programs that reach a broader or universal audience. Also, lower earnings in the American pension system produce lower pensions. So if you have a low-paying job, you're going to receive less money from Social Security than you would otherwise do. In addition, many benefits in the American welfare system are provided by employers. These are things like health care, pensions, etc. The employers are not required to provide these benefits, and often they only provide them to their high-skill employees. So if you have an excellent job, you're likely to have benefits. If you have a crappy job, you're less likely to have these benefits. And again, this disproportionately affects women, Latinos, and African Americans. And lastly is an argument relating to shorter lives, reducing pension benefits. Blacks and whites, men in particular, white men tend to live about 5 years longer than black men after they reach the age of 50. And this means that black men have fewer years of receiving their pension after they retire. The slide I'm showing now shows poverty by race, ethnicity, and age. The poverty line is $18,000 for a family of 3. And the picture is broken into 3 groups: people under 18, people of working age, and people 65 and over. The dark blue is people who are poor. The light blue is people who are near poor. Near poor is defined as having twice the amount of the poverty line. And you can see in this graph that Hispanics and blacks have much higher levels of poverty than do Asians and whites. And this is especially the case among the young, among children, and among people 65 and over. And you can see that the near poor rates for blacks and Latinos are almost 60%. So just tremendous disparities. I want to talk a little bit about the history of African Americans in the United States and its implications for the welfare state. So, after slavery, there was a period called Reconstruction in which African Americans made tremendous gains in voting. Blacks had the majority in the South Carolina legislature. Many blacks went to Congress. It was a real renaissance in American life, but it only lasted about 10 years. Whites responded with a violent campaign to end black voting rights, to reimpose a system of slavery by another name called sharecropping, to establish rules regulating racial behavior and segregating the races, and destroying voting rights in the South, really for both blacks and for poor whites. There was also discrimination and segregation in employment, both North and South, in education, and especially in union membership. As many blacks migrated to the North at the time of both World Wars, they were pushed into ghettos in the North. So you had the creation of these large ghettos in places like Chicago, Detroit, etc., Indianapolis, around 1914. Since the Civil Rights Movement, brought an end to sharecropping and Jim Crow, a huge improvement in voting rights, affirmative action policies, a reduction in occupational segregation, a declining wage gap between blacks and whites, and a growing middle class. At the same time, however, there was an increasing demonization of poor blacks as criminal or dependent on welfare. Along with that came a rise in incarceration, intensive policing, and also felon disenfranchisement, especially in many states in the South. The picture I'm showing you right now shows the lifetime chance of being sent to prison at current U.S. incarceration rates. For all Americans, that chance is about 6%. For men, it's about 11%. For Latino men, 17%. And for African American men, 32%. Enormous disparities in incarceration rate potential. I'll talk now a little bit about the welfare state in particular and its treatment of African Americans. African Americans were initially excluded from old age insurance. FDR needed Southern votes to pass Social Security. As a result, he acceded to Southern demands that he exclude domestic workers and farm workers from Social Security, and this was most African Americans at that time. In addition, most African Americans were excluded from aid to dependent children because aid to dependent children was administered locally, and this allowed Southern providers to discriminate against blacks. In addition, blacks were excluded from most employer-provided benefits because both employers and unions discriminated, and blacks were confined to low-wage jobs that did not provide these benefits. Black women were also less likely to receive Social Security spousal benefits for two reasons. One, they had a lower marriage rate, okay, so were less likely to receive the spousal benefit. Second, they had higher labor force participation, which meant that they were often receiving their own benefit rather than the spousal benefit. And lastly, as Michael Brown has argued, the problem was not so much with the welfare state as it was with the fact that blacks were excluded from American unions and from many occupations and were forced to accept public relief as one of their, quote, major occupations. That's how Brown puts it. He argues that the main problems in race relations are not with the welfare state, although there are problems there, but instead with problems in the labor market, the housing market, and in the educational system. One thing I want to talk about that is directly related to the welfare state is the issue of residential segregation. Redlining is the practice of drawing a line on a map that argues that certain areas are too risky to make loans in those areas. And until the 70s, it was accepted practice within the real estate industry that black areas and areas in transition were too risky to provide loans. And this practice was also institutionalized within federal lending programs the Federal Housing Administration established during the New Deal. These loans ended up aiding white suburbanization, leading to the creation of the ghettos and sustaining the ghettos. There's a film in this course that I highly recommend called The House You Live In, which talks about this issue. One point that's made in the film that I think is an important one is that this segregation had lots of negative consequences, which I'll talk about, but an important consequence related to wealth creation. The homes in the white suburbs were booming and appreciating, so white homeowners were able to benefit from this massive increase in the price of their home. Meanwhile, homes in black ghettos were depreciating. Thus, the government, by providing these Federal Housing Administration guarantees for loans, had subsidized massive wealth creation on the part of whites and not on the part of blacks. So the welfare state played a very important role in this story. I want to talk briefly about some of the effects of residential segregation. A variety of sociological studies have examined these issues. One is the idea that it disconnects people. And I should also mention that the United States has segregation not just by race, but by class. And so I'm talking in particular about poor, black-only areas in many of the major cities. The argument here is that this can disconnect people from networks of employed people. It can make it harder to establish good schools, good churches, playgrounds, child care centers, and this makes it harder for people to raise their kids. People who are segregated have fewer political allies, which makes it harder to get the public resources they need to sustain local institutions and also to attract business investment to their community. Both whites and blacks associate ghettos with crime, with housing decay, with falling real estate prices, and so wish to avoid ghettos. There are also weaker social networks and community organizations in these areas, and this can reduce neighbors' willingness to supervise young people and increase crime. And lastly, segregation has enabled the intensive policing and mass incarceration regime of the last few decades. Thanks for watching.